Hey, welcome back to the show. If you guys thought that the Minnesota fraud was at the forefront, it definitely is now after Nick Shirley's report. His video has gone completely viral, millions of views, and Americans are outraged at the amount of fraud that's still taking place in Minnesota. But before we discuss Nick Shirley and what's happening in Minnesota, I think there's something that's not being spoken about enough that we need to talk about. Ilhan Omar's net worth. Her net worth has surged over the last couple of years. And I'm not saying that she's guilty of any of the fraud that's taking place in Minnesota, but the surge in her wealth coincides with the timeline where fraud was taking place in Minnesota. So let's take a look.
There's been interest growing around this disclosure because earlier this year she slammed claims of being a secret millionaire. What more can you share, Jeff?
So the 2025 disclosure, first reported by the Washington Free Beacon, shows that the Minnesota congresswoman and her husband have a net worth between $6 and $30 million, a roughly 3,500% increase compared to 2023. The Free Beacon reporting the couple's financial gains came from her husband's two businesses, a winery in California and a venture capital firm headquartered in Washington, D.C. Those assets were valued between $5 and $25 million by the end of 2024. In 2023, that number was reportedly less than 1,000. But Omar, a founding squad member, slammed online speculation back in February, claiming she was a secret millionaire. Omar saying, quote, "Since getting elected, there has been a coordinated right-wing disinformation campaign claiming all sorts of wild things, including the ridiculous claim I am worth millions of dollars, which is categorically false." Omar went on to say she is a working mom with student loan debt, trying to raise a family while also maintaining homes in Minneapolis and in Washington, D.C.
So what Ilhan Omar wants us to believe is that she's like an everyday American. So she's carrying student debt, probably having a hard time paying for it, yet she has $30 million in assets. The only reason she's carrying this student debt is as a talking point, so that she can say, I'm just like every other American. I'm carrying student debt. I'm still struggling to pay this off. I'm struggling to pay my mortgage here, back home, yet she's sitting on $30 million. But let's listen to a little bit more on the companies and how much they were worth in 2023 and how much they were worth in 2024.
The Minnesota congresswoman and her husband's assets clocked in at up to 3,500% higher than in 2023. The details in the filing show the vast jump came from her husband, Tim Magnet's two companies. Those are a winery in California and a venture capital firm. Combined, the Free Beacon reports that the companies had been worth only about $51,000 at the end of 2023.
So Omar is one of the members of the squad who are always talking about how bad capitalism is, right? But what is she doing? She's using the principles of capitalism to enrich herself. How is that for hypocrisy? But remember, the wealth belongs to her husband, right? So it technically doesn't belong to her. Who does that sound like? Nancy Pelosi. How much is Nancy Pelosi worth? $275 million. And what does she always claim? Well, my husband's a businessman. He's the one that's making all this money. It's not really me. Yeah, but he's probably doing it with your inside information. This is just too suspect. This is too much happening at the same time for the corruption that's happening, the fraud that's happening in Minnesota, not to be connected with the accumulation of wealth by Omar and her husband. But I guess only time will tell, right? But that's enough about Omar. Let's go ahead and move on to the Minnesota fraud, which apparently is still taking place. So apparently local news stations were already reporting on this fraud and nothing happened. Here's Alpha News reporter Liz Collins talking about some reporting that she did previously.
Yeah, good morning, Guy. After this viral YouTube video, I think it's frustrating for many of us to admit here, but this has been going on for years and basically out in the open. If you saw that video in Minnesota, we have stories dating back nearly a decade now. Fake daycares, millions of dollars in cash and carry-on luggage flying out of our airport by Somali men each week. The question, though, now I think with the glare of the national spotlight, will it actually stop? I wanted to highlight just a recent story we did after some investigation over at Alpha News. I think it highlights how deep this goes. But we looked into the Minneapolis Public School District and asked why it hired all of these transportation companies after we received reports of vans sitting in parking lots or having no riders in them at all when people would see them out on the road, literally no passengers ever. And we found one particular company paid millions of dollars by the school district. And here's the kicker. A new state law took effect in 2023 guaranteeing school districts 100% reimbursement for transportation costs for homeless and highly mobile students. So what do we see? We see that number of homeless students skyrocket in the Minneapolis school district by 40% the next year. But that's often what we're seeing is you uncover this legislation that seems to be tied in so many cases to this fraud guy.
So I know what she just said may be shocking to some of you. She's talking about suitcases full of money, millions of dollars being flown out of the country, out of Minnesota. And the question that you're probably asking yourself, that cannot be true. Is that true? Yes, that's true.
We appreciate that. I have to say, though, this sounds like something out of a spy movie. People going through security and getting on planes with suitcases filled with millions of dollars in cash. Tell us what you've actually seen as a TSA agent during the time you worked there.
Well, I've actually seen a lot of things, but the most shocking is exactly that. I saw suitcases filled with millions of dollars of cash, and the couriers were always Somali men traveling in pairs. And they got through the checkpoint. It just really absolutely blew my mind the first time you open a suitcase and you see millions of dollars of cash.
In other words, large amounts of physical currency being transported overseas to various destinations that include Africa and the Middle East. And this was reported by local TV investigations years ago. Now, the news reports actually noted that this was happening weekly and hundreds of millions of dollars had left the airport that way. So to the second point that she was making about transportation expenses being given back to the district, being reimbursed back to the district 100% for kids who were homeless. If you hear what she said, the number of homeless kids that were requesting this transportation increased by 40%. What does that sound like? That sounds exactly like the autism claims that defrauded Minnesotans of millions and billions of dollars. So what the Somalis are doing is they look for these weaknesses in the program, the points of vulnerability, and then they just exploit them. And I think that's the worst part about this whole thing. Once again, the Minnesotans opened up their home, their state, to the Somalis who came from a war-ravaged country. And what did they get in return? They got robbed blind. They got fleeced. Remember, there were a lot of people that were trying to report the fraud. But as soon as anything came up, all they had to do was scream racism and everything went away.
Whistleblowers are coming forward, and if they are real, Mike, and if what they're saying can be documented, and what they're saying is they told Tim Walz, they told Keith Ellison about the fraud when it was happening, and they not only didn't do anything, they retaliated against them. Mike, if that's true, if that can be documented, these guys need to be prosecuted.
But Governor Walz refuses to take any type of responsibility for the fraud. All he continues to say is that the fraud is not as bad as is being reported. He's saying that the Trump administration is full of white supremacists. He's saying that ICE is waging war on American citizens. Anything that will deflect from the fact that the fraud is devastating to the state. And instead of being on the news all the time, reassuring Minnesotans that he's taking action to ensure that the damage is minimized, what he's doing is he's putting posts on X saying, Happy Catter Day. But it's not just Tim Walz refusing to take responsibility. The Lieutenant Governor, Peggy Flanagan, just came out in support of the Somali community as well. Take a look.
Assalamu alaikum. My name's Peggy Flanagan. I am the Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota, and I'm really honored and humbled to be here with all of you today. I am incredibly clear that the Somali community is part of the fabric of the state of Minnesota. And when I think of being part of Minnesota and growing up here, the Somali community has always been a part of my Minnesota. So I want to just encourage the community to know that we're with you. We've got your back. I am here shopping today, and just encourage other folks to show up, support our Somali businesses.
How about reading the room and understand that this is probably not a good time to show unwavering support for the Somali community? I think this is the problem with the Democrats. They focus on the minority. It's like focusing on the 80-20 problem. Why isn't the governor and the lieutenant governor out there talking to the Minnesotans, the 5.7 million Minnesotans? Instead, they're out there parading around with the Somalis. How does that show leadership? How does that show governance? You cannot continue to cater to the minority, especially when that minority is accused of stealing billions of dollars from the state. But I know some of you are probably asking yourselves, well, how easy is it to commit fraud in Minnesota? It can't be that easy, right?
Well, I'm still hung up on the fact that you had the U.S. Assistant Attorney John Thompson last month talk about these two individuals who had heard that Minnesota's Housing Stabilization Services Program was such easy money that they traveled to Minnesota, enrolled their companies in the program, returned to Philly, and then submitted the fraudulent claims from Philadelphia. So it was so easy that it encouraged this fraud tourism. He said that there are possibly 14 high-risk Medicaid programs that are being audited, and up to half of that amount of money, so $9 billion we're talking about here, could potentially have been fraudulent.
So for those of you not familiar with fraud tourism, it's an informal term used to describe a pattern where individuals travel to a specific location because committing fraud in that location is easy. And that's often due to oversight, law enforcement, and generous benefits programs, just like Minnesota has. You know, I'm glad that Nick Shirley published this video. I'm glad he did the investigative reporting and he went out there and he did his due diligence, he did his homework, because now what's going to happen is Americans are going to ask the question about their states. Is the fraud happening in social welfare programs in our state as well? And I can tell you right now that the answer to that is yes. Nick Shirley's video has been so big that the vice president commented on it. Take a look.
Vice President J.D. Vance reposted the video on X and wrote this dude has done far more useful journalism than any of the winners of the 2024 Pulitzer Prizes. Adding, what's happening in Minnesota is a microcosm of the immigration fraud in our system. Politicians like it because they get power. Welfare cheats like it because they get rich.
Here's Tom Emmer also talking about Nick Shirley's video.
And Republican Congressman Tom Emmer took a shot at Minnesota Governor Tim Walz in his own post. Quote, Tim Walz sat idly by while billions were stolen from hardworking Minnesotans. What Walz refused to address for 7 years, Nick Shirley has uncovered in one day. The fraud in Minnesota is so brazen, so vast, it's impossible Walz's administration didn't know about it.
You know, the worst and saddest part about this whole thing is the fact that Minnesotans were fleeced. Each Minnesotan pays about $8,050 in total taxes per year. How difficult do you think it is for the average American to save $8,050? That $8,050 is gone. And I don't think Americans would care if they were supporting social programs here in the States, but that's not what they're doing. All that money is going into the pockets of cronies, and that is unfortunate. Governor Walz's office responded to Nick Shirley's video. This is what they said.
Meanwhile, a spokesperson for Governor Walz responded to the criticism in a statement to Fox News, telling them, quote, the governor has worked for years to crack down on fraud and asked the state legislature for more authority to take aggressive action. He has strengthened oversight, including launching investigations into specific facilities, one of which was already closed.
So in other words, he continues to deflect. He's not taking any responsibility. You saw the lieutenant governor not taking any responsibility. You saw Ilhan Omar's net worth increase by 3,500%. You saw that she's now worth $30 million. So as Minnesotans were being fleeced and all their money was going abroad to fund who knows what, Ilhan Omar's pocket was just getting bigger. But remember, it's her husband's money, not hers. All right, that's it for today. Like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, stay balanced.